The cool breeze rustles the leaves in the woods at night. 15 hunters turned werewolves accompanied by 15 witches snuck their way like shadows creeping up behind the trees. Their target was a vampire king in the infamous Gothic castle ahead. They are confident. The hunters trusted some of the most powerful witches in the land. Their potions and ointments could turn them into furry monsters with heightened senses, hoping they could slay the vampire lord once and for all. But there's a wisp of crimson smoke moving with the wind. It takes shape of a man behind every tree, then vanishes again. The werewolves growl and grunt, but who were they trying to fool? The witches moved their fingers to conjure up spells and curses. Then a whispered voice sent shivers down their spine. "You poor, beautiful souls. You come into my woods clutching spells and fur, thinking you'd corner the king of the night. But I've tasted the blood of your ancestors. I know what fear smells like. While you snuffed the air and muttered charms, I walked between your shadows. While you sharpened your claws, I was already behind your eyes. Since when have you all been so brave enough to hunt a monster? When I am the reason monsters have learned to hide." There was a castle on a foggy mountaintop of Cascada, a land now infamously known for a vampire infestation. The castle was dark, eerie, and frightening with Gothic architecture. The lights inside made the windows look like they were tinted with blood. The walls looked blackened and worn out, having stood through many winters. This castle belonged to a duchess named Cecilia Rosenthal. She had striking red hair and her skin was paler than a gloomy day. She was a peculiar woman that many knew of but very few had seen. The duchess would only wander the castle when the sun set, but her movements were rather odd. Outside folk would report seeing a wisp of crimson smoke moving from window to window. She would appear at one side of the castle and within a blink of an eye show up at the next. But as time passed, she became better known. Cecilia Rosenthal was the vampire responsible for the peace treaty between humans and vampires. This feat alone was something remarkable, especially when human folk were frightened of vampires ever since Nasdaq the Vampire Elder caused so much of chaos and bloodshed in the land. Hunters respected her, human folk adored her, and the elves and dwarves maintained a good relationship with her. But for those who wanted her gone, couldn't do much about it. Not when she had a bodyguard that not only protected her but the castle as well. His name was Vlad Tepesh. For as long as Vlad Tepesh could remember, he did the same job every day and night. The man's hair was long, black, and wavy with a hint of gray. He was slender with a prominent jaw and thin eyes, with a diagonal cut on his upper lip. Though his appearance never mattered since the outside world never saw him, not when he also worked in the infamous Gothic castle as a servant. Vlad also had a wife and daughter, Francesca Tepesh and Marie Tepesh respectively. Unfortunately, he would only see his family once a week. Miss Rosenthal turned Vlad Tepesh into a vampire when he collapsed in the castle while serving her tea. With her knowledge and resources from her library, the Duchess deduced his illness to be cancer, something very rare at the time. In order to save her most trusted and loyal companion, she had no choice but to make him just like her. So how did it work? Step 1 was the bite. Cecilia drank Vlad Tepesh's blood from his neck. This was a means to weaken him and initiate the bond. Now the bite alone doesn't usually turn the victim, it's just the first step. Miss Rosenthal had to be careful as too much blood loss could have killed him without the exchange. Step 2 was the blood exchange. Now for the transformation to be complete, the Duchess gave her wrist for Vlad Tepesh to bite and drink the blood from her body. This blood exchange would create a supernatural bond which allowed Cecilia's vampire gift or curse to be passed on to her servant. Step 3 was for Vlad Tepesh to then die as a human. When he regained consciousness, he was reborn as a vampire. Miss Rosenthal's blood would not only keep him alive, but also transfer her skills and power onto him. Since Vlad Tepesh had already been skilled enough as a bodyguard and servant, his vampire strengths amplified greatly. Then, Cecilia Rosenthal fell ill over time. She aged rapidly and her hair turned grey. She had 3 wizards working for her in the outside world, and they said it was blood contamination. Her vampire strength and speed were slowly leaving her body with each passing day. This made the castle more vulnerable to attacks, and Vlad Tepesh fought tooth and nail just to defend it. But without his Duchess providing him counsel, the vampire began drifting into the abyss. Late at night, when he was alone, Vlad Tepesh began having visions. Maybe what he was seeing couldn't be real, but it sure as hell felt like it. He kept seeing another version of himself living in the castle. Vlad could only see this version in a mirror, one that he would talk to and quarrel with tirelessly every night. This mirror version of himself seemed to show him what he would look like in the future. Still young, but great hair, paler skin, and glowing red eyes. One night when he stood in front of the mirror, the apparition had become too much to handle. "Look at you, weak and pathetic. It baffles me how a duchess so well known for her strengths would choose you to be her right-hand man." Vlad Tepesh, the real Vlad Tepesh, learned how to ignore the voice, but this time it angered him. Cecilia Rosenthal was someone very dear to him, and slander against her name will not be tolerated. What would you know about honor and loyalty? Be gone, you evil spirit. This castle doesn't share a home with you.
But I'm you. At least what you should be. How many demons have you killed protecting your beloved Duchess? Does that make you feel strong? Does that make you feel worthy? Just think about how many humans would bow to your feet if you let me take over.
Why don't you leave me alone? Why do you torment me so? Please, just get out of my head.
I shall go now, but you will need me again. And when I come back, you will not expel me. You will not quarrel with or hate me anymore. You will embrace me and you will smile.
Vlad Tepesh grabbed a candlestick and threw it at the mirror, breaking it into 1,000,000 pieces. Cecilia Rosenthal, as weak and weary as she was, walked down to the study holding the wall for balance.
"Vlad, is everything okay, my dear?"
Vlad Tepesh quickly adjusted himself, wiping away the sweat and the frown from his forehead. "Yes, Madam Rosenthal," he said. His demeanor changed to a polite, loyal servant on a dime. He never wanted her to worry about him. She had already saved him from cancer, and it was now time for him to give something back. Concern and worry wanted those things. She gave a warm smile, but she knew her bodyguard wasn't okay. She knew there were dark forces at play, and before she dies, she would find out who or what was responsible. Then she glanced at the pendant around Vlad's neck, a pendant gifted to him by her. Could a tiny thing like that really be causing all of this? She had her suspicions, but there was no way to prove it. Normally, Vlad Tepesh would clean up the castle and leave for home to spend time with his family. But since Madame Rosenthal's health worsened, he lived there permanently, taking care of her. Then he heard a knock on the castle doors. He flexed out his fingers as his razor-sharp claws for fingernails pushed out, like there was an invisible switch of some sort. When he opened the doors, he grunted in disdain. 3 old men stood outside the castle. They had long pointy grey beards, wore hooded robe-like cloaks, and carried staves in their hands. "Evening, Vlad Tepesh," they said, bowing their heads with utmost respect. They have been helping Cecilia with her hybrid research. Miss Rosenthal had a vision to create a team of vampire-werewolf hybrids to fight alongside the humans. She feared that the monsters roaming the land were growing in numbers and that the chance of survival was being held by a thread. Maybe she could find good vampires like herself and team up with the strongest werewolves that ever lived. Maybe she could create something new that wouldn't be harmful to mankind. However, forming a peace treaty with werewolves, just the way she did with the humans, was far more difficult than she thought. These old men walking into the castle were not weak or fragile as they looked. In fact, they weren't even human, but not many people knew that. These mysterious beings were known as the Wizards of Three. Dark magic is always frightening. Spells, curses, hexbags, and rituals brought along just as much fear as an army of vampires and werewolves. The Wizards of Three, Cornwood, Caleb, and Connolly, were masters of such craft, but they were feared more so than usual, for these wizards were alive for more than 1,000 years. These old, cunning yet wise men were believed to be the mentors of the Crones, a coven of evil witches also serving hell. Though the Wizards of Three did not simply serve hell, they were part of it. Their existence was bound to infernal hierarchy, their longevity maintained by the dark forces they had sworn allegiance to. Demons whispered their names with reverence, for they were not mere pawns of the abyss, they were its architects, shaping the mortal world in ways that benefited hell. Their allegiance was not one of servitude but of partnership. They were allowed to roam the world freely, spreading corruption, toppling kingdoms, and ensnaring souls. In return, they were granted power beyond mortal comprehension. They received an unholy immortality that kept them away from seeing death. Century after century, they renewed their pact, offering the souls of 1,000 innocents as tribute. The ritual was a thing of unspeakable horror, a grand ceremony where the air reeked of burning flesh. The screams of the sacrificed echoed into eternity. With every renewal, their power grew, their knowledge deepened, and their influence spread further into the world. Though their usage to the underworld or even Earth itself was not the sole reason for their importance. The Wizards of Three display a level of submissiveness when in fact, hell needs them more than their demons. Cornwood, Caleb, and Connolly were not just feared for their power but for their knowledge. Being alive for so long, learning the ancient dark arts, rituals, curses, countercurses, spells, they knew anything about everything. They could snap their fingers and one would cease to exist. They knew how to paralyze demons, vanquish angels, and conquer armies without even trying. Therefore, when they met Cecilia Rosenthal, they conveniently hid the fact that they were working for hell. When the Duchess fought for the humans, she never hid behind lore or the comfort of her castle. She was front and center in battle. Cecilia was the first vampire in history that could walk in the sunlight, all thanks to the Wizards of Three. They gifted her with a pendant that carried unique powers, one of them being protection from sunlight. Little did Madame Rosenthal know that the pendant was cursed like a hex bag. Sure, the pendant granted great power, but it was slowly killing her from the inside. Hence, Madame Rosenthal fell ill from blood contamination and died shortly after. Now that same pendant was transferred to her servant. When the Wizards of Three met Vlad Tepesh, they became wary. As strong, evil, and cunning as they may have been, something about this newly turned vampire sent shivers down their spine. They had no reason to be afraid of him, but they were, almost like they sensed the monster that he would turn into. They cast a protective spell around the castle, a force field-like aura that would prevent any attack from damaging the stone walls. They would also be on standby if Vlad needed anything, just a manipulation tactic to show him that they were on his side. Then they heard the conflict in the study. Vlad Tepesh talking to himself in the mirror. The wizards made a note of his turmoil and exploited it. Maybe they didn't need the pendant to kill him since he served no threat to hell, but what if the pendant could do more? It would still contaminate his blood, but it would also turn him into a monster. What if that pendant unlocked that latent evil festering within? Few days passed and Vlad Tepesh brought along his wife and daughter to live in the castle. All the generational wealth Cecilia Rosenthal had was transferred onto his name. They never needed to work a day in their lives, but still, Vlad would never leave the castle, and he wanted to make sure that he maintained the same standard that his duchess did. However, after a while, his wife Francesca fell ill. No doctor, book, wizard or witch seemed to know what was wrong with her. Vlad Tepesh, desperate and filled with panic, thought he could save her just the way Cecilia Rosenthal saved him. Though, due to the blood contamination in his body, Vlad made his wife more sick. She fell into a deep slumber and hasn't woken up since. Since that day, the vampire lord had been spending his time in the study, reading up on books in Madame Rosenthal's library, hoping to find a cure for his dying wife. Marie would go to school, do her homework, and give her father company. He swore to himself that he would never turn her, no matter how many times she asked to be. Vlad wanted his daughter Marie Tepesh to live a normal, happy life. That little girl was now the only friend Vlad Tepesh had. That was the only person in his life who showed him love and affection every day. His daughter was the reason that he never became a monster. This important point was made well aware to the Wizards of Three. He maintained the agreement with them, the same one Cecilia Rosenthal had. Every fortnight, they would have to find two of the most vile, evil, and dangerous criminals in a town or village and bring them to him. Those were the only people that he would feed on, and only those. No innocent person would be harmed, and being a vampire was no excuse. However, the Wizards of Three weren't exactly honest men. Sure, they would bring 2 men or women from each village or town every fortnight, but they weren't fitting the criteria Vlad Tepesh had requested for. They were ordinary folk, innocent, living their human lives, working their daily jobs, and feeding their families with an average salary of 25 coin per month. That tiny detail was left unsaid and became step 1 of the wizard's plan. This information wasn't withheld by mistake. The demons commanded the wizards to get to work. Their shady dealings, lies, and secrets became the catalyst into pushing the vampire lord over the edge. Hell didn't want Vlad Tepesh. Hell needed Dracula. And so, while her father was too occupied finding a cure for his dying wife, the wizards kept a close eye on Marie, the school she went to, the subjects she studied, and the friends that she made. They possessed one of her classmates and tricked Marie into accepting an invitation to a party on Halloween night. Now Marie was excited, because who wouldn't be if you haven't ever attended a party? All she needed to do was cough up the courage to ask her father for permission. That became step 2. Step 3, however, was out of the wizard's control. For the final step, they hoped the hunters would take the bait. Hunters, brave men and women, had formed groups across the land, sharing their knowledge and skills alike. Not by choice, rather by circumstance. When Nazduk, the vampire elder, created the very definition of fear into the world, human folk had no choice but to resort to taking matters into their own hands. Hunters, while stereotypical, did have distinctive features. Men looked rugged, untidy, long beards, torn clothes, buff to a certain extent, with scars as tattoos. The women were lean and strong, hair and fingernails poorly maintained, and their skin became flaky. Both male and female hunters had a persona of wild, unkept, and unruly-like behavior depending on the faction they belonged to. Most of the time they would wear village clothes or adorned in animal pelts. Hunters were usually looked down upon for their futile attempts of eradicating monsters from this world. But as they grew in numbers, monsters began taking them seriously. There are 4 factions of hunters. First faction are the trackers, skilled in tracing vampire and werewolf movements using folklore and scent-based methods. Second faction are the executioners, fighters trained in vampire and werewolf killings, usually former soldiers or warriors that had no place left to go. Third faction was the keepers, knowledge holders, lore masters, relic protectors, chroniclers. These folk worked hand in hand with elves, learning new information on a daily basis about vampires, werewolves, and witches. Fourth faction were the renders, trap makers, blood alchemists, or creators of anti-vampire tech. Many keepers became renders from the knowledge they possessed. For every faction, hunters shared a universal code, and that's what people latched onto. That's what gave them hope. They have sworn an oath to eradicate every monster even if it kills them. However, their rule was to always check before the killing, since many teenagers, especially on All Hallows Eve, would dress up as monsters they've read about just to frighten their friends. Now, coming back to the story, hunters made an agreement with Cecilia Rosenthal decades ago. They knew she was a vampire, everyone knew she was a vampire, and folk were okay with that. Not all monsters were evil. Some creatures hunters had encountered showed more kindness and compassion than humans. Cecilia would request for 2 criminals from either a town or a village to feed on every fortnight. These people were the scum of the earth. Hunters accepted this offer as long as no innocent human was harmed. Though, since her servant Vlad Tepesh had taken over the castle, rules began changing. Hunters noticed that while every fortnight remained the same, 3 old, cunning wizards would snatch away 2 people from their towns and villages at night. But these folk were innocent. Hunters knew Vlad Tepesh was a vampire. They also knew just how strong he was, since he was the sole bodyguard of the castle for many years. The agreement between human and vampire had now fallen through the cracks. They had to kill him. Despite Vlad being a protector of the Duchess, there was something about him that sent chills to those who set eyes upon him. Not just because of his immense strength or fascinating speed, but the man was going through turmoil in his mind. Even if Vlad Tepesh himself didn't see it, the vampire bodyguard was a ticking time bomb. Hunters began facing backlash from the ones they've protected. They received hate from the Fellowship of Elves for letting an evil vampire have its way. They were deemed unworthy for having gone against their oath. They became desperate, working with witches in Redwater, trying to expand their reach in taking out Vlad Tepesh. Folk believed that maybe hunters weren't as good as they thought themselves to be. It was easier slaying lesser vampires, but why were they backing out against Vlad? But that changed on All Hallows Eve. Trackers reported movement outside the castle near Cascada. A tall figure wearing a long grey coat, long dark black hair with a hint of grey, with pale skin and broad shoulders roaming the night. They confirmed this information with the keepers and they agreed it matched the description of Vlad Tepesh. Hence, the executioners and the renders formed a group and followed the vampiric being, spreading the word throughout their land that the vampire king would be slain on All Hallows Eve. Vlad's daughter Marie was 15 years of age, but she was almost as tall as her father. Her hair was naturally dark brown, long and silky except for the night of All Hallows Eve. That night she dyed it dark black with a hint of grey. She walked up to her father reading books in the study when she said,
"Papa, tonight I think I'm going to be you."
Vlad Tepesh moved his eyes from the words on the page to his daughter and gave a crooked smile. He saw the pale makeup she used and spent much time perfecting the scar he had on his lip. Marie told him there was a Halloween party in Cascada and her friends from school had invited her. Until now, she never asked her father for anything. She was worried, nervous, and petrified, not knowing how her father was going to react. Vlad Tepesh stood up and walked out the study. The girl's face changed from a bright smile to a disappointing frown, bowing her head in defeat. But then her head lifted again as she saw her father walking back into the study with a long grey coat in his hand. For tonight, if you would like to be me, then you would have to wear this, he said, donning the grey coat over her. The length of the coat sufficed, but the width was too big from Vlad's broad shoulders. Remember, my darling, stand strong, fierce, and proud. Your father lives an honest life. Make that show with every stride you take. Show them that while I may be different, I still stand true to everything the Duchess wanted. Then he removed a pendant from around his neck and put it on hers. This pendant was the first gift Madame Rosenthal gifted to me. I hold it very dear to my heart. Keep it safe, it will bring you good luck. Marie's eyes lit up, filled with tears as she embraced her father. Remember, he said, you'll be back to the castle before 8 p.m., Marie. Not a minute later. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Papa, she said, wiping the tears as her feet moved in rhythmic excitement. However, that moment was 4 hours ago and it was 9 p.m. The vampire paced around the castle impatiently. From time to time, he checked on Francesca to take his mind off things, but it wasn't helping. Then that voice inside his mind returned. That eerie whisper said such cruel things to him.
You shouldn't have let her go. What kind of father are you sending your daughter alone on Halloween night?
And so he walked to the castle doors, ready to open it, but the doors opened themselves. His eyes widened and his body stiffened. The Wizards of Three stood at the entrance, holding Marie's body in their arms. The girl was burned to a crisp. Truth be told, she was unidentifiable if Vlad's pendant wasn't still around her neck. There were 3 puncture wounds in her body, caused by sharp spears, something the burns couldn't hide. The Wizards of Three said, "The hunters thought she was you, my lord." Vlad Tepesh fell to his knees, but he never cried. That numbing pain, that ache in his soul crushed his spirit, that no tear would have left his eye in that moment. The wizards rambled on, but when the vampire's eyes turned red and his fangs pushed out, they knew it would be best to stop talking. The castle was filled with silence. Vlad Tepesh made the proper burial arrangements. His wife still did not wake up from her deep sleep. That poor woman never knew her daughter was skewered and burnt like a wild boar. The Wizards of Three hid their cunning smiles, whispering to each other. This misunderstanding happened because of them. This feud between vampire and human had escalated to this point because of them. Their plan was working, far too well in fact. Vlad Tepesh donned his coat at the castle doors before leaving. Then he turned to the Wizards of Three and asked, "Which faction of hunters did this?" His voice wasn't sounding the same. It was an eerie whisper, like the voice that fought against him in his mind. "All of them, my lord," the wizards replied in unison. "These hunters, they have families, yes." Vlad Tepesh felt like Cecilia Rosenthal was turning in her grave at that moment, screaming at him not to do this. There would be no going back from it. Beneath their hooded cloaks, hiding their evil smiles, the Wizards of Three responded, "Yes, my lord. They have wives." The night was darker from the storm that hit the city of Redwater. The pouring rain drenched Vlad's coat as he walked almost lifeless towards the village. He was expecting celebratory cheers and dances, but the village was silent. He saw the hunters gathered in a circle deep in conversation. They didn't look too happy, and their wives stood by their side, comforting them by either holding onto their arms or stroking their back with a gentle and loving touch. How nice that must feel, Vlad thought. The murmurs stopped when they looked at the vampire standing in the village. Reflex would dictate to them to grab their weapons and slay down the vampire right then and there, but they couldn't. The hunters were mourning killing an innocent girl. They knew they made a grave mistake. They knew they didn't have a leg to stand on. Vlad Tepesh never said a word. He walked aimlessly towards a nearby shed and found rope. Within a blink of an eye, he dashed forward so quickly that he appeared as a blur to the naked eye. The hunters no longer had their wives by their side. Vlad had them by his, with their hands and feet tied with rope. The hunters grunted as they now reached for their weapons, but the vampire held out his finger. This was the first time they noticed how long and sharp his fingernail was. Was it there before? He sunk his fangs into their neck violently and quickly, while forcing them to drink his blood. 2 small punctures sat just above the curve of their collarbones, neat, surgical, yet impossibly deep. The skin around them was pale, almost waxen, but the blood hadn't been completely drained. Then they collapsed on the ground on their side. With blood in his mouth and dark veins crawling up his face, Vlad then spoke.
2 minutes' time, these women would wake as vampires just like me. They are going to hiss and growl at you, waiting to feed on your blood. I'm not going to stop them, but you are. You're going to slay them down the way you hunters slay vampires, and burn them at the wooden stake you have there.
The hunters charged forward, renders, executioners, trackers, even the keepers who never knew how to fight. Yet they couldn't land a single blow onto the vampire. He dodged and swayed around like he was dancing until the woman woke up. Was this some trance-like hysterical state that consumed the vampire? The hunters panted, looking at their wives turned vampires, then back at Vlad Tepesh. "We won't kill them," the hunters said.
Oh, I see, but you will kill an innocent girl.
"We didn't know it was her until too late."
Well, now it's not too late. You will identify the monster as your hunter code dictates to you. Kill them first and then burn them at the stake.
Everyone in the village assumed Vlad Tepesh was joking until he cut the rope restraining the vampire wives. He watched the woman attack villager after villager while he pulled a chair to watch. The hunters hesitated at first, but they had no choice. A wooden stake to the heart, a silver arrow, a sharp dagger coated with elvish medicine. So many weapons to choose from, but the hunters had no motivation to use them. And then they did. They killed their own wives while telling themselves that they were monsters. But Vlad Tepesh didn't want it to stop there. Now they had to make sure what was killed stayed dead, just the way they did to his daughter. The hunters had to burn their wives' bodies. While the villagers cried and pleaded with the vampire holding onto his feet, Vlad Tepesh applauded as he watched the vampire woman burning at the stake. He applauded hearing the sound of their bones bursting into flames, while watching their flesh turn into crisp, just the way Maurice did. The hunters fell to their knees right near the stake, numb just the way Vlad Tepesh felt. The vampire walked behind them, placing his hand onto their shoulders, giving them a false sense of comfort.
Now do you feel what I feel?
The hunters sobbed and asked for forgiveness. They cried and tried to speak, but Vlad Tepesh had extended both his arms to the side as his long razor-sharp nails grew like claws. He sliced their bodies into tiny pieces that could barely be picked up. If only he waited for them to talk. If only he heard why they were after him, then everything would have been different. But it was over. As gruesome and relentless as his revenge was, it was over. So it seemed. The vampire looked around the village and witnessed the gaze in people's eyes. They would come after him, they would hunt him down, they would attack the castle. They would kill his dying wife in her sleep. The voice in his head told him on how they all knew what happened and did nothing about it. And so Vlad Tepesh's first massacre took place that night. Young and old, innocent people were being gutted like fish in mere seconds. Sharp claws inside their necks, faces, chest and back. If one didn't know better, they would think a wild animal was attacking the village. So much of bloodshed. Such anger and rage had driven him to insanity. The voice in his head echoed throughout his mind.
I told you I would come back. I told you you would not expel me away this time. I told you you would embrace me.
There was an elderly woman crawling on the ground with whatever little life remained as she uttered one word from a language that was old and almost forgotten, but Vlad Tepesh knew what it meant. The devil, she said, translated, struggling to breathe. Vlad Tepesh giggled. His laugh rivaled that of a thunderstorm. His coat was covered in blood as he turned around ever so slowly. But that smile on his face did not belong to him anymore. Wide, eerie, and frightening to its core. His sharp fangs pushed out of his mouth, and his piercing red eyes were so fierce it would frighten demons themselves. Then just before the old woman drew her last breath, she uttered that word again. Dracula.